This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, thank you for joining me this evening. The paper I'm presenting, as is indicated on the first slide, clearly is a joint endeavour. It's not just me. The historical investigations were very much Jill's part of the equation. So I'm very glad, therefore, that she's here. If there are any real issues to be addressed on the documentary side, I will bat that one neatly in Jill's direction, as you will observe. Now, I'm talking this evening about Grange, which is or was part of the Cinque Ports confederation, together with Beaksbourne, two of the limbs of the head port of Hastings, strangely located in Kent. The Cinque Ports confederation, as you're undoubtedly aware of, was a group of towns and smaller settlements, mostly but not exclusively located along the coasts of Kent and Sussex, and with a number of the main head ports, Hastings, Winchelsea, Rye, Dover, etc., being the principal towns around which a number of smaller elements formed, all of which worked together in a agreement with the Crown, delivering shipping for whenever the king needed it, vessels to transport men, horses, do services for the king. They were active in piracy suppression and were focused on doing themselves a good favor, knew a good setup when they saw one, and in terms of their original development, seem an ancestor or a predecessor of the later Royal Navy. There have been a number of archaeological excavations carried out at Grange. I work for a company called Pre-Construct Archaeology, and we carried out a series of large-scale excavations around the perimeter of the former manor, which occupied the area mostly between the former manor and the bank of the River Medway. The area from the Medway to the north, to Watling Street to the south, formed a finger of land that constituted the liberty of Grange. The earliest evidence of real durable occupation of the site is Roman. There are some elements that demonstrate earlier human activity there. There is some Mesolithic evidence, there is some Bronze Age and Iron Age, but these are redeposited finds, mostly lithics, the odd bit of pottery, no features, so it looks fairly ephemeral until you get to the Roman period. And it then takes off quite dramatically. There are clear field divisions, there are a number of barns which are replaced over time, so there is quite a continuous occupation from the early Roman period up until the end. And of some significance is the presence of a multi-story mausoleum, although obviously by the time we found it there was no story at all, other than the one that I'm telling you. But the nature of the foundations was such that clearly it had more than one floor to it. It also showed evidence of having been extensively robbed, the stone elements presumably having been reused in other buildings on or near the site. We were most lucky that the people who robbed the foundations were kind enough to leave some evidence of their presence. So we know that the robbing took place in the mid-11th century. The mausoleum showed some evidence of having been abandoned before the period of robbing took place. It was occupied by a middle-aged lady who was buried in a lead coffin, and there were a series of secondary burials associated of young adolescent to young males. The significance of that I have no way of knowing. We have a number of small mammal and bird bones associated with the mausoleum, mostly comprising field vole, field mouse, snipe. There is evidence of a thrush, some robins, and the brown long-eared bat. All of these animals are known to be prey animals of the tawny owl. And we therefore think that we have a tawny owl roosting in the mausoleum for some considerable period of time. There was quite a lot of this material there. Tawny owls like trees, they don't really like ruins as such, so it suggests that we have a mausoleum that is quite heavily overgrown and not frequently visited by people for this fine assemblage to be there for us to discover. At the end of the Roman period, there is some limited evidence for Saxon activity on the site, mostly with features nearer the waterfront end, the north end of the excavation area, comprising a small number of pits, including a rectangular pit, not a backfilled grave, but clearly rectangular, about 2 meters long and 1 meter 20 wide, which was filled with stone rubble. And the interesting find that came from this was a late 5th century Saxon gilt silver bow brooch in the Nidum style or style 1, a very early form of Scandinavian style brooches, of which there is one other similar known also from the Kent area. It is suggested that this find is likely to have been redeposited from a funerary context, because that doesn't really seem to be a sensible reason for it to be in a large rectangular hole, otherwise filled with rubble. The find of this particular brooch suggests that, despite the fact that there isn't a great deal other than this of any import for the Saxon period, that the site wasn't a complete backwater at this time. Now, the first substantial link with documentary sources place it in the ownership of Bishop Odo, who is known to have been involved with his half-brother on a battlefield near Hastings. And Odo is most certainly well known to all of you as having held on to lots of bits of land and property across England. He and his link with Hastings, we suggest also because he is linked with Beaksbourne, the other limb of the Cinque Ports confederation placed in Kent, that it is his ownership, his call on the liberty of Grange that initiates the link with Hastings rather than any of the other Cinque Ports. He is known to have been involved in the building of a Motte and Bailey defence at Hastings, and his presentation on the Bayeux tapestry, where he is thought to have been instrumental in commissioning the tapestry, clearly demonstrates his particular interest in Hastings. He lost his holdings at Grange following his little tiff with his half-brother. In 1082 he is sent into exile and prison, and he doesn't after that regain any call on Grange. It is a gentleman by the name of Godwin Freni, who in 1088 seems to get the ownership, or he holds the liberty from the king from 1088 onwards. There is an early reference to a chapel on the site in the Textus Referensis, where a chapel at Grange is referred to as being involved in getting chrism in the Rochester diocese. This is the sacred oil that would have been necessary in the chapel. The chapel is of interest because there is also a later chapel on the site that I will refer to subsequently. In 1120, Grange was held by members of the Hastings family. There's a Robert de Hastings who seems to be a descendant or a relative of Godwin Freni. And it's for a period of some 250 years that the Hastings family then holds on to the limb of Grange. They clearly are well established as barons of the Cinque Ports confederation, with having interests in Hastings and Rye, with being allowed to not pay the toll of tax for loading ships, and being therefore of some recognizable importance. The site's location is of particular interest in the sense that it seems to have offered a location where ship-going vessels can land from quite early on. It's not just a strand. There seems to have been a quay or a hide that ships could land at, and the location on the lower Medway allowed access to the then traditional trading route along the Swale down the coast of England. The service owned by the Hastings family was that of two manned vessels with two oarsmen, although you also get a reference to Aviron in the mid-12th century, when there is a William de Hastings who has control of the site. And the translation of Aviron is not quite clear. It seems by the end of the 14th century already to have been lost in the mist of time as a term, as it is used by a clerk in New Romney in the late 14th century, and he uses or seems to translate this as amrons, which doesn't really seem to be related in terms of its meaning. What we think is that the importance of Grange within the context of the Cinque Ports Confederation at that particular part of the estuary is because of its opportunity to offer the provision of pilots, so that when shipping goes up this relatively confusing area of creeks and marshes and banks, there is a facility of guiding people through, both for the sailors from Hastings going up to London, as well as any of the King's men coming down the Thames and seeking access to the Swale. A pilot would have been essential to ensure safe passage. The location with its quayside and a road connection that in some context seems to go back at least to the Roman period, when there's evidence of a road there connecting the seafront to Watling Street, with the surrounding remnants of the Roman remains, reusable as building materials, would have made this a particularly interesting location to establish a site, and an economically easy one to go for as well. The Archbishop of Canterbury initially owns the area on either side of Grange, I guess somewhat to his irritation not having this particular bit. The difficulties of navigation are shown to continue up to today. Timothy Spall, the actor, not all that long ago needed to call out the lifeboat crew as he got stranded and lost on his barge. There was a sailor who used his car sat-nav to guide his boat around this particular part of the Thames, and managed to get stuck. And then, of course, there is the sailor who used the road map with the idea that he would sail around the coast of England, and he got stuck around the Isle of Sheppey, sailing around this for 36 hours, thinking he was doing rather well and on his way to Scotland. Obviously, these were not the best of sailors, but it does give you a view that you might need somebody with local knowledge to help you out. The Manor House, set slightly back from the waterfront and currently occupied by a nursing home, is located here in the area that you can see delineated in blue, which is a large moat that was partially excavated by pre-construct archaeology. It's about 4.5 meters wide and up to 2.5–3 meters deep, and it encloses an area of approximately 115 by 108 meters, meaning that it encloses some 1.2 hectares, which means it's amongst the larger of the 6,000 or so moated sites known in England. most of which are less than half that size. Between 1374 and 1384, Grange is held by Sir John Philpott, knight and alderman, wool merchant, mercer. He became sheriff and mayor of London, clearly a man of some weight. He came from Lower Holstow in Kent, and he acquired his interest in the site by his marriage to Margery, daughter of Richard de Croydon, a rich fishmonger. Being involved in the wool trade and having lent the king significant sums of money in the order of hundreds of pounds, which at the time would have been very substantial, he got the right to collect wool customs on exports of wool, and his call on Grange would have allowed him the privileges of not paying certain taxes when exporting certain items from Grange, giving him a competitive edge in his commercial activities. He establishes a chapel at Grange, replacing the earlier version that is there. The ruined remains of this chapel are still to be found on the site. You have the windows and doors outlined in Kentish red stone, and there is significant evidence of repairs dating to the 18th century. The illustration here, the etching is by Catherine Thorpe, dates to about 1776, when the chapel is no longer used as a chapel and has a thatched roof. It's used as a barn at this time. The replacement of the chapel by Philpott in the 14th century is quite typical for the London elite. They would have needed a chapel to provide them with protection from the horrors of the plague and the protection of the Christian God that would deal with all those things that Philpott couldn't quite manage in terms of his own worldly protection, which he was actually quite good at. He figured out what was going on during the peasants' revolt, and was involved in the activities on the king's side at the time, which was clearly the right side to be. He is also involved in piracy suppression as a direct result of his involvement with the Cinque Ports. He has easy access and call on vessels which he can then use in piracy suppression. There are direct financial advantages to this sort of activity because any ships captured from pirates then are prizes which become the ownership of the privateer involved in the suppression activity. There is reference to a John Mercer, a Scotsman, who just before Philpott tracks him down was involved in an act of piracy where he captures 15 ships from Spain, heavily laden with merchandise. These therefore don't get returned to Spain, but they become the property of Philpott, who puts them at the service of the king, astutely playing his financial and political aspects out. You have clearly people who get quite jealous his competitors get quite jealous at his success, and having some royal protection is never a bad thing under these circumstances. After Philpott's death, his widow married an Adam Bam. I think this was his fourth or his fifth wife.
Yes.
He clearly got. He was interested in having wives, I think. She marries Adam Bam, a goldsmith and future mayor of London. Their son Richard Bam continues the tradition, also a goldsmith and mayor. They establish a chapel at Gillingham Church, which is still there and still standing in a non-ruined state. When Joan Bam died in 1431, she was the first member of the family to be buried at the church chapel of Grange, and it's from this point onwards that the chapel at Grange itself is no longer needed and is deconsecrated and becomes used for secular purposes. There is a second ruined building on the site known as the refectory, measuring some 18 by 6.5 meters. It's right at the north side of the moated site, on the inside of the moat. It is likely to have been a multi-story building. The windows and doors also framed in Kentish ragstone, and the size and structure of the windows here suggest that this is slightly earlier in date than the construction of the second chapel at the site. So we're probably talking early 14th century for this particular structure. Interestingly enough, both the refectory and the chapel are on different alignments, and both of these are on different alignments from the standing nursery home in which we suspect the remains of the ancient manor can be found. And they are also all different from the remains that were found immediately to the south of the nursery home, which comprise a series of sandstone foundations of a large cellar measuring about 4 by 5 meters. There's evidence of a stone foundation which seems likely to be tied into something substantial, perhaps a tower. There's a pitch tile hearth of 14th century date, which is likely to have been related to something like smoke bay or louvers in the roof of this particular part of the buildings, as chimneys come in about 100 years later in this particular area. Large chunks of this these foundation remains seem to be related to foundations that support timber framed structures, and though there seems to be a little bit of a mix of stone built and timber framed buildings, this particular area seems to be largely timber framed, and the fines assemblages associated are relatively poor, all local pottery, local bricks. There is one crucible which dates to the 17th century with some copper slag from this particular area. It's suggested that we're dealing here with serving wings of the servant wings of the manor from the late 13th century through to the 17th century, showing evidence of a series of rebuilds and modifications as time progresses. presumably associated with changes in ownership during this period. In the late 18th century, there was a documentary source by John Nichols who states that the house, as it stands then, is an ancient brick-built structure. Now, archaeologically, all the bricks that we found, with the exception of about 3 Dutch bricks, which are of 12th century date, and very unlikely to have been used in any construction of any sorts. They get used as a ballast for Dutch vessels, and so they get sometimes used in flooring material in a British context, but they're certainly not used as a building material. So the chances of the early manor house here having been constructed of Dutch bricks is nil. Then we've got 16th and 17th century bricks, which are too late really to go for John Nichols' suggestion that you've got an old brick-built manor house. The options for what we've got here is that either Nichols didn't know what he was talking about, always possible. We could alternatively have much of the ancient fabric still obscured within the existing nursery home on the site. Not impossible. We know that there are certainly bits dating back to about 1633 as part of the remains of the current nursing home. Alternatively, the early brick version was very efficiently robbed, with the brickwork having been taken off for reuse elsewhere. Not an uncommon practice, but unless we dismantle the nursery home, which I haven't had permission to date, we will not know for sure one way or the other. The artifacts assemblages, which we'll look into a little bit further, are particularly interesting. They are not as rich as one finds at places like New Romney and Sandwich and Dover, where excavations have turned up large amounts of small finds and significant quantities of imported pottery from Germany, from the Low Countries, from France, from elsewhere in Britain. What you find at New Romney in terms of pottery is largely local, with the exception of some centong ware, which comes from France, 14th century date, and has been linked with the wine trade. Now the wine trade is of importance to the Cinque Ports confederation, although it's mainly Winchelsea that is heavily involved. There is no reason why Grange couldn't have some role to play, if only in terms of consuming the stuff. So other than the centong ware, nothing much surprising within the ceramic assemblage. The centong ware is of some elite status. The medieval small finds were mostly unstratified and recovered as a result of us using a metal detector on all the spoil of the material that we excavated. Having said that, most of it comes from unstratified deposits, but we have a nice range of material, some long cross pennies, some horse pendant fittings, some belt fittings, an iron knife, a lead token, a French jettle, and then for the 15th to 17th centuries we've got copper buckles, a book mount, a pair of copper alloy scissors, a strap hook fitting which may be part of a sword belt, and an iron rowel spur. A particularly interesting find is a disc-shaped openwork copper alloy cross-staff head. I'm very pleased I can read this. There are a group of these finds. One variant is disc-shaped, the other variant is more round or spherical in shape, and parallels for the disc-shaped type are known from St. George Street in Canterbury, right next to the medieval church, an 11th century context. There is another find, not dated, but also from close to a medieval church at Wixford in Warwickshire. A mid-11th century one from Fishamble Street in Dublin, in a non-religious context, if you like. There was one from St. Thomas's Hospital in Southwark, a redeposited context, so not dated, but clearly it's St. Thomas's is a religious establishment in the 11th century. And there are two others known from Billington and one at Ridge, both treasure finds from Hertfordshire, surface finds as a result of metal detecting. 19 spherical examples all come from the southeast of England and the Midlands. Looking at their distribution, the red symbols here indicate the spherical examples, the green ones the disc-shaped type, with the exception of the example from Dublin. They clearly all come from England. When you look at the distribution, you try and figure out what the hell it means. Can't figure out anything with regards to trade or with regards to Bishop Odo or say the practice of pilgrimage. There isn't anything obvious that we can tie it into, but I must admit that the distribution looks like there should be something. So if anybody has any suggestions, I'll certainly hold myself recommended. These particular objects have been looked at in some detail by greater minds than mine. They have been associated with slender staffs or perhaps staffs is the best way probably to describe it, held by people of some significance on a rood screen at Nayland Church in Suffolk, and on a number of medieval alabaster carvings. One on a scepter held by Herod, the other one on an alabaster where John the Baptist is about to lose his head. You can see the young lady holding the plate on which the head is meant to be placed, and our staff terminal is attached to what can best be described as a very large key ring held by John the Baptist's jailer. We therefore can link these objects to a symbol of status, an identifier of power and legitimacy, perhaps linked because of its slight religious association with regards to finds with churches and hospitals. They are clearly of some local England focused importance, as we don't have any examples that come from the continent. interesting with regards to its 11th century date. We have another example of a slender staff. There is Bishop Odo on the Bayeux tapestry, seen to encourage his young men waving his staff, or a baculum, rather than a sword. Now, in terms of his waving a staff or a mace or a blunt instrument rather than a sword, there have been some discussions of why Odo should be doing this. He seems to perhaps want to display the fact that he's not as bloodthirsty as the knights waving swords about, although perhaps it's as much an element of courage that is being displayed here. It's not uncommon for British warriors, even in more modern contexts, to go into battle not waving anything more lethal than an umbrella, for instance. There's an example of a paratroop captain at Arnhem who, led his troops with an umbrella. The other interesting aspect is perhaps the significance currently of the term baculum, which translates as penis bone. The bone that you find in a number of mammals, dogs, wolves, bears, and perhaps Odo was waving a metaphorical bone around. He had a bone to pick with his opposition at Hastings. I think that is pushing it a little bit far, because actually beyond what the interpretation will bear, as the term baculum in its use as meaning os penis is relatively recent. Nevertheless, I think what we can say is Odo is shown here wearing a staff, or carrying a staff, waving it about in an agitated manner, which certainly would have been conducive to any terminals attached falling off. The small group of 30 or so small finds from Grange are in fact all of a type that would have been worn or carried around on a person or on a horse, and I think reflect the fact that we have a greater mobility of perhaps slightly better off people moving through this site. It's not the kind of finds that you would find, say, on a medieval farmstead. It's casual losses of the slightly more well-to-do, who are found here in a higher concentration as you are dealing with a site that is of some significance at this period. The presence of the staff head terminal, as well as the book fitting, are quite typical of what one would expect of a Cinque Port limb. I suggest documentary evidence for all Cinque Port sites indicate a great interest in literacy. There have been book fittings found at quite a number of Cinque Port locations, and the association of the status object of the staff fitting clearly fit well in this context. So we have here building remains, ruined remains that show a site of some importance. We have a large moat, show it to be a site of some real importance, and the area that it enclosures being very large for comparable sites of the period. A small group of small finds that demonstrate that we have a group of people moving through who can afford to make the casual losses of the type that we observe here, and we've got some elements that demonstrate perhaps a link with the wine trade. Clearly, I think fundamentally the reason why this site gets established where it is found is because we have an access point to a location where seagoing vessels can land, with a direct link to Watling Street behind, and lots of building material that can be cheaply reused to start making your medieval manor house. Elements of the link with the Cinque Ports confederation continue to play a role until fairly recently. In fact, in 1946, the pub that is located on the site continues to have its closing time dictated by the magistrates in Hastings rather than those in Gillingham. Meaning that the patrons here at Grange had the advantage of being able to continue to drink for half an hour longer than their brethren in Gillingham. And that's all I've got for you today.
Thank you very much. Yet another example of variation of licensed trade. Right, does anyone have any questions?
I was wondering, it's most unlikely at that time, but was there any road link or land route between Hastings and Grange at all? I'm just thinking that and I know it's centuries later, but the first turnpike in Kent was between Hastings and London in about 1700 or 1710. So I just wonder if, and that was a fishmonger who transported his goods to the city of London, so maybe there was a route of some sort.
There are references to fishmongers being able to deliver fish in 3 hours from here to London on horseback, presumably down Watling Street. Although I think that's presumably part of their sales pattern rather than being definitely true, because it does seem rather fast. In terms of having a direct road link with Hastings, I think clearly you've got Watling Street right down to the Kent coast, and there would have been connections from Watling Street that would have allowed a road link to Hastings, but exactly which route that would be, I need to check rather than being able to tell you off the cuff.
Are there other excavated manorial sites that we know belong to London mayors or other important London merchants? And how does the material culture from this site compare with that type of manorial site? And you're pushing a link with Cinque Ports connections, but what about seeing it as primarily a manorial site that's got this particular other history too?
There isn't a great deal. There is a site in Woodford Green that at some point has sort of laid at Heart Hospital, which in the early post-med period has a link with people in the city. But I can't think of any known sites that are excavated that were known to be mayors of London, their sort of summer residence, so to speak.
Do
there is a much grander one, which is Penshurst, isn't there, from the mid-14th century.
That is true, yeah.
That, you know, if you are a mayor and that's your proper summer residence, that's the sort of scale, although Penshurst would be exceptional even for a mayor, it's the sort of scale that you're building on, and something. I did wonder, I was going to ask whether anybody has actually investigated the nursing home, because somebody like Sarah Pearce, even if there's nothing, it's still been apparently modernised inside, somebody like Sarah Pearson might be able to work out a good deal from the plan of how it had developed and whether there was anything pre-1700 left in it.
I'm going by the listing of the county council, because it's a listed it's a locally listed building. So people have had a look at it, but how good they were, the listing doesn't say.
The listing can be terribly variable. They're looking primarily for features which make it good to look at, either externally or outside, and therefore a visible archaeological importance or aesthetic importance and age, rather than the development of building. And a building without visible early features, even if they could guess that it was in part a medieval building, would not necessarily be listed.
No,
and
and
certainly if it's early 16th, 17th century, it wouldn't necessarily be listed.
Certainly the exterior doesn't look modern, but it looks mostly 19th century.
Yes, I mean, that might be, quite often in Kent and Sussex, you do get these sort of vastly expanded 19th century buildings which have a much earlier core of
absolutely
of timber frame building, but those tend to be farmhouses rather than on the manorial side like this. But it might be worth asking someone like that to look at it.
Yeah.
Someone with local knowledge. One thinks of Sarah Pearson or David Martin, but David Martin tends to be so busy that he can't be distracted to anything for which he's not paid a large sum of money.
Yes, my personal experience with the building is just from the outside, and there is nothing obvious, and it's more and more getting obscured with them
adding bits,
bolting on bits.
Yes.
But certainly having a look at the roof space should be
and
quite.
Also, 19th century maps will be quite helpful to see how it's changed. And I presume, since you were able to show views of the chapel and the etc., that you've already searched for 18th, 19th century views of Grange.
Yes.
Nothing showing it has any significance in those.
We looked quite carefully at the fabric of the surviving ruins to identify what kind of building materials there were in those, and there were some roofing tiles reused, which it's sometimes difficult to see whether you're dealing with medieval versus post-medieval variants, particularly when you're talking about things that are still stuck in a wall. The sort of owners start frowning on you if you take a hammer and chisel a piece out and say, I'd like to have a look at the fabric. So, but with regards to any of the bricks that were stuck in those particular walls, they were all parts of 18th century at the earliest repairs.
Yeah. If the house is likely to be, nursing home, isn't it? It's likely to be altered and added to. Perhaps someone could ask to be alerted at that stage when walls are perhaps being opened up, and also floors taken up. A building I was associated with, the lady said there were older foundations under the floor, but we didn't know what to do, so we just laid the concrete.
Yeah,
it's heartbreaking, but
present legislation, or actually it's planning guidance, means that any alteration that they do, if there is a local planning officer who is on the ball, means that they will have to carry out standing building recording work and archaeological research. In fact, since we've left sites, I've been trying to get back on the back of work that has been done, but neither has the work been taken forward in grey literature in a sense that has made it accessible, nor, well, obviously it hasn't been published either. This work, in fact, a variant of this paper will come out in Archaeology Ltd in the next issue.
It would be nice to think that somebody from what remains of the County Archaeology Service would sort of read it, and if, you know, applications for changing the building came in, would make the mental connection. This might be an interesting building, but...
Is that German girl still working with county councils with these buildings?
No, I don't know.
Conservation laws.
I don't know. I don't know. Perhaps I could become ill enough to be admitted to the nursing home, and in fact, some specialists in buildings to come and visit me. A bag of tools.
All the bits of work that have been carried out and for which there is grey literature information, work not just done by PCA but also by the Oxford Archaeological Unit and the Kent Archaeological Research Unit and Archaeology South East. All of that has been carried out under planning rules. So at least up till now, the planners have been aware of it, but clearly, as a result of austerity cuts, one doesn't know who will replace who and whether they will be equally astute when it comes to making sure that conditions are attached.
But at least Grange has been it will shortly be published, including all the stuff that was in the grey literature, so that, you know, with all the references, so people can follow it up. So often, with the honourable exception of PCA, that doesn't happen. You know, it just remains in the grey literature.
Could I push you both to speculate about its origins as a member of the Cinque Ports, and taking into account two things that you haven't made much or anything of so far? The nature of the territory as a little enclave cut out of Gillingham, and with what on Hastings' map anyway looked like rectilinear boundaries.
Yeah.
And he says also, I think, that the manor was larger than the Liberty. And secondly, even more important, the place name. Is Wallenberg right that it's a Wick name? And if so, where would you take that speculation? How far back before the 11th century?
Your second one I'll leave to Jill.
Yeah.
In terms of its location, there are two references in Domesday to Gillingham, and one is specifically to Grange, the other one to Gillingham as medieval market and with its church, etc., which seems related to the property of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so I think the earliest documentary reference to it as being in control of Odo is there isn't anything earlier, is there?
No, and then it goes on to the Hastings family.
Yeah, and in terms of trying to work out why it gets located there rather than anywhere else. It's I think what we have in the Roman period is a villa site, not that we found the villa. I think the villa is outside the excavated area. I think there would have been very substantial building remains that they could have reused. And I think anybody who starts digging a hole at the nursing home itself will find reused building materials from that villa. It would have been a really significant advantage. You're in a location where, yes, you're on a river, and therefore you can bring stone in if you want to build a stone building. But if you have it there on the site, you've got it ready for use. Very much cheaper than anything else. You have that quayside that allows you to come in with not just large rowing boats, but you can get in the first types of relatively deep draft vessels. And you've got the direct connection via probably a very dilapidated road, but nevertheless a metalled surface from the waterfront to Watling Street. All of which would have made it a very attractive location. How Odo then manages to identify this and what that means if one were to compare it, say, with Beeksbourne, what Beeksbourne has got to make it of particular interest. It suggests that the Normans had some pretty good intelligence going on, getting local knowledge at a great degree of detail right from the moment that they're there.
I don't think there's any problem about that. I think that's what they did. And I think there are thousands of collaborators, if you want to call them that. It's a new king.
Yeah.
Of course, you're going to tell him what he wants to know.
particularly when hiding information when it is not a percentage.
Yeah.
That's not telling anyone this from anything they don't already know.
But even then, you need to process it. It means that you have to have the ability to set up a civil service, if you like, a group of people who you can trust and who are not rapidly going to look in, to their own pockets and so on and so forth. And perhaps the fact that Odo, I know it's suggested that he does it because he's interested in becoming Pope, but clearly Odo at some point succeeds in annoying his half-brother sufficiently for him to have a significant drop in status, shall we say.
If he was Earl of Kent, could it be anything to do with something that the Earls might have had before the conquest?
It could have been, yes.
But there's no evidence of that from Grimsby.
I can't. No. I'm looking at it. There's not. But it is, unlike Beeksbourne, which is part of the complex of estates that he's given, because he's given this great solid block of land in Kent around and between the church estates. He takes Grange and Gillingham as a tenant of the Archbishop. So that's a more deliberate action by him, rather than simply the consequence of being an Earl of Kent and giving vast estates in Kent.
He has got these valuable manors on Who, pretty much opposite,
Yeah.
and I think the way the river flows, Grange always was kept more clear of all the silt and ooze and black mud just by the flow of the river than on the peninsula side. Yes, so you could perhaps bring across all the grain from the Who Peninsula over into bigger and offload bigger boats and move it up. What there was by way of key signs on who, which I've just been looking at, was on the far side of the peninsula, whereas just opposite Grange would have been handy. With regard to the rectilinear boundaries, I know on Hastings they look rectilinear, but when Alan Baker reconstructed the Archbishop's Manor of Gillingham, either side, actually the boundaries in his reconstruction don't look so rectilinear.
Right.
So when you go there, or before they built all the houses, when you went there and drove and walked down the roads, they took all lead fairly straight down to the waterside. But I think everything was all oriented to the waterside. And with regard to the name, if we go back to that slide from the Textus Rofensis, which is about 6 or something, I'll tell you what I think. My son-in-law is Swedish, and he says that I have to pronounce Wallenberg's name Villenberry, which is pretty much like you pronounced it, but not Wallenberg, so I'm not allowed to do that any longer. There we are. So up at the top, you've got, first line, you've got Greenwich paying 9p, and then West Greenwich paying 9p, and then Grange is on the bottom line in the middle with the red G, and the scribe, I say, has slightly lost concentration and needs a cup of coffee, and has started writing Greenwich again, and then has scratched out the sort of 4th and 5th maybe letters, which he and has scraped them out. Actually, what you end up with is G-R-E and then scratchings and then N-I-C. And believe me, I've looked at that quite a lot, but I'm open to other suggestions. So I think the earliest form we have of it is G-R-E-N-I-C. Greenwich, I would be prepared to listen to arguments that that was a kind of Wick early trading town. Grange, in its early form, I don't think so.
But there are all those, the other forms right through to the 14th century are in ECH,
ECH,
and not
Not, yes, they are G-R-E-N.
Have you talked to Paul Cullen?
No, because I haven't seen him lately.
Right, okay. It's hard to pin down, but
you said that and not me.
There's one other thing with regards to the linearity, that there's a piece of archaeological evidence. We have some evidence for ridge and furrow on the site, which has a sort of linearity to it.
Oh dear, I just talked English heritage, there was no such thing in Kent. I better talk to you now again. What date was it? Was it datable, ridge and furrow?
If I was pushed at, say, 13th century, but I mean, you know, it's agricultural soil that gets turned over. The dating, there are all kinds of fancy techniques that you can now do, but it costs you a lot of money. I don't know.
Anyway.
Everybody happy?
Was the moat defensive of the drainage? The moat.
The moat, I think, was defensive. Considering its size, and also, you know, in those days, digging tools were not quite as easy as they are now. So it's a great effort to dig such a deep hole. You don't need to dig anything quite as substantial just for drainage.
Although that's getting into a different debate entirely, about the nature of moated sites. It depends what date you think that moat is.
It was backfilled, as we think, in the 16th century.
Right.
And I'd reasonably happy with late 12th, early 13th.
So normal sort of a date for establishment of moated site.
Yeah.
I think of that scale, that sort of regularity, I I'm dubious about their defensive capabilities. I mean, if you mean to build a defensible structure, you build a defensible structure, and there are banks associated with it.
Yeah,
no
banks, no walls, no. We have some evidence for late what we think is probably fruit trees. There's lots of tree bowls.
It's just most moated sites of that sort of scale I can think of are episcopal and associated with palace complexes.
Yeah.
So substantial residential complexes, but no sort of defensive qualities. Gaywood in Norfolk, for example, which is outside Lynn.
I still don't think you'd put it in for drainage.
No, I don't think it's drainage. I think it's more sort of a way of demarcation and sort of keep inconvenient peasants out as much as anything else.
Well,
and a way of making a statement.
You certainly don't want the riffraff in.
I don't believe many of these things are defensive. I think as much as anything else, it's almost a garden.
What it sounds more as if it's the Londoners' pleasure car.
Yeah,
I think you would have it larger than simply for residential buildings if you wanted to allow pleasure garden.
I think that would be my sort of reading of that sort of site in this sort of context.
Is the moat datable?
Yes, in the sense that we know definitely when it's backfilled. The beginning is always a little bit because what you date is the first silting episode, if you like, and therefore the material that you get from things like this tend to be, not a pot that is of that immediate date that they break in order to make things easy for
like
us.
Smashing your watch sort of thing.
Exactly. So whether you then find old pots that get broken, that get washed in, or what have you. So your dating of the beginning is a bit iffy. But
I just wondered if it was Philpott who might well have a nice motor status symbol. Money's no object for people like that. So
it certainly would make sense.
Because it's a bit bizarre. I mean, you don't really need the defence on the seaward side unless you're expecting Vikings or something.
It's a very nice rise. You can see for a long way off who's coming across the water. Behind, towards Watling Street, is another issue, but you can certainly see a long way off who is visiting you on the water.
You have the Archbishop's Palace about a mile and a quarter up the uphill to the west. Yes. So if you wanted to make a statement, this is my manor, my liberty, my chapel. I can do pretty much what I like with it. The other place is not far away. But whether it was Philpott or the de Hastings family who were there till the Black Death came in 1349, they sold up. I mean, there were none of them left. They sold to Londoners.
Right. My feeling would be, and it's based on no archaeological sort of context or anything, it might well be a statement of someone saying, this is my pleasure. But that's fine. I don't buy moats generally being moated houses, moated sites without obviously defensible structures on them. They get used as defensible structures, but not usually until the Civil War.
In that case, would there be a causeway?
How
would you get
potentially, they're quite often permanent bridges. Certainly, the East Anglian examples I know of look more like tend to be associated with very sort of ostentatious. Bishops of Norwich have one at Gaywood, which is concentric moats. There's no defensible reason to do that. And if you're the bishop in a jam, you'd go straight to Lynn anyway. You wouldn't be besieged in your own manor. You could possibly help. There are clearly gardens associated with that one. Certainly in Cambridgeshire and Somersham, there's a quite well documented example of moated site with associated garden earthworks. This looks more of that, and those are very large moated areas with large grounds that would be taken up by by domestic structure.
Mm.
So it seems more akin with a garden site to me, but that's...
I mean, Philpott.
This is all supposition, I hate to do
He did have defence of London on his mind.
Yeah.
He built one of the stone towers on one side of the Thames from which a chain was going to be
Oh, a
built.
chain tower, okay.
But no, the other one was never built.
No,
So later on, much later, in the Dutch Wars, a chain defence was put across from Grange to
there was one built in Norwich in the late 14th century.
Maybe, you know.
So Portsmouth had a chain tower.
Both defence
yeah,
and,
those are in the context of town walls.
yes,
That's very different than to a domestic context.
it is, yes.
I'm slightly wary of imputing defensive characteristics onto something which we can't demonstrate.
No,
Built
but
that night.
you could see that like you're keeping the peasants out.
It's like a heart, if you like. I mean, that's...
In addition, perhaps, is this a dry area? Would it be a kind of reservoir for water in time of need?
The deposit did suggest that it held water at some point.
Mm. And perhaps also for fish.
Could be, yeah.
Potentially.
Food.
Yeah, I mean, remarkably little evidence for fish was found on the site, but you know, you do happen to have to be lucky in a sense as whether you find the right midden or not. But the fish that did turn up was sea fish rather than fresh water.
It's also what you'd expect from a site next.
Sorry?
There's also what you'd expect from a site where it is. I mean, you would expect some cultivation of freshwater fish, we've got sea fish available on tap. Anyway, that's an aside I've stuck into, but that's one. Anyway, anyone any further questions? No? In which case, we can thank our speaker in the usual